Thank you. I said I'm working on some new material here, and what you're about to hear today is actually the very first time anyone is getting a public preview of an article that will be coming out in a forthcoming edition of First Things magazine. So we will see there. I hope that it has a big impact. And my talk is called The Evangelical Elite Problem. The evangelical elite problem is that there isn't one. There are famously no evangelicals on the Supreme Court, 6 Catholics, as we talked about yesterday. There are few evangelicals in, again, those key senior-most leadership positions in the most important culture-shaping domains of society, like the Supreme Court. There are very few leading evangelical academics or artists, few evangelicals at the top of the high finance world. The number of prominent evangelicals in Silicon Valley can be counted on the fingers of one hand. I've been reading all these articles about how Christianity is getting big in Silicon Valley, but if you'll notice, they list the same 4 guys in all of them. There aren't actually very many evangelicals leading movement conservative think tanks or publications in Washington, D.C., despite the fact that evangelicals are the largest and most important voting bloc in the evangelical coalition. Now, there are 2 exceptions that prove the rule, 2 domains that are exceptions that prove the rule: politics and business. There are a lot of very successful evangelical people in electoral politics. You think about Governor Bill Lee of Tennessee is an evangelical, Senator Jim Banks from my state of Indiana is an evangelical, lots of evangelical elected officials, people who are successful in politics. The other is business. There are a lot of really first-rate evangelical business leaders and entrepreneurs, but I find it interesting that they are overwhelmingly concentrated in profitable but prosaic businesses with low cultural leverage. So you can think about restaurants like Chick-fil-A, retail like Hobby Lobby, distribution like Gordon Food Service, maybe an oil and gas guy. But you can contrast that with, say, Rupert Murdoch's media empire, Google, or BlackRock. So these top media organizations like Fox and the Hollywood studios and all that he owned, and the newspapers, they really shape the culture. Google's algorithms determine what people see online. BlackRock's investing criteria make CEOs jump through hoops to meet them. We control very few institutions like that. We're great at making money, but we haven't been so good at accruing cultural power. And D. Michael Lindsay's did his doctoral dissertation on this topic of evangelical elites, which was published in 2007 as a book called Faith in the Halls of Power. Lindsay actually lives in Indiana now. He's the president of Taylor University. And he was actually celebratory about how many evangelicals he thought now had access to the corridors of power. So his book is very optimistic in tone. But if you read it, what you will notice is that his examples are overwhelmingly concentrated, again, in politics and in these sort of prosaic businesses, you might want to call them. In the other areas, evangelicals were very thin, much thinner on the ground. So his evangelical academics, for example, the people he cited, I think Mark Knoll would be one that was in there. I can't remember all the names. James Davison Hunter, he put in there. These were all people that overwhelmingly studied evangelicalism, itself. They were sort of the academics that studied evangelicalism. Now, to be clear, there are actually some true evangelical elites. You can think of Francis Collins, whom we met earlier, which, whatever you think of him, he is legitimately a world-class geneticist. He ran the Human Genome Project. He was the head of the NIH. You could also think of Ben Carson, not in his political roles, but as a pediatric neurosurgeon. He was one of the best pediatric neurosurgeons in the world. I think he ran the pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. Or you could think about even Justin Bieber, right, in the world of music. But evangelicals are very underweight in these elite realms relative to the share of the population, to be sure. And I think it's interesting, evangelicals don't even think about being elite in terms like this. Ask any evangelical, who are your elites? And most likely, the names you will hear will be all pastors, theologians, or other professional Christians. We're going to think about who are internal elites. And almost all the writing out there on evangelical elites talk about these kinds of people, Big Eva, for example. Whereas if you ask a Catholic, who are your elites, I think you're going to hear a lot more lay figures on that list. You might hear J.D. Vance. You might hear Amy Coney Barrett. You might hear people of that type. And I think this is actually also how the culture at large perceives things. One of the things I like about AI is when you train AI, they basically dump everything that's ever been written into it. So it's sort of a summarizer of sort of the gestalt of society. And so I did a query on Grok AI for the top 15 living evangelical elites. All 15 of them were pastors or other professional Christians. Then I gave it an identical query about Catholics, and only 3 people were clerics. 20% were clerics, 80% were lay people. And I want to be clear that what I'm talking about here are lay elites in society at large, not evangelicalism's internal clerical elites. Now, the reasons why evangelicals punch so far below their weight in society have been widely discussed. Historian Mark Knoll talked about the scandal of the evangelical mind. Again, the scandal being that there was no evangelical mind. Evangelicalism, he wrote that book 30 years ago and remarkably still relevant in a lot of ways. Evangelicalism is very populist. It's a very populist movement, and populism tends to be very skeptical of elites and institutions. I think much of evangelical theology neglects creation and essentially puts, all of the value on saving souls. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Evangelical culture tends to emphasize the role of women in family life and the domestic sphere, which I think most people here would probably approve of, but that certainly tends to militate against the emergence of female elites in the world. So that's essentially half your population that's not in the game. And evangelicals are also very often cocooned inside their own parallel institutions, like Christian colleges, that direct them away from elite pathways and networks. And again, this is often very good. In fact, I've spoken very positively about many of these evangelical institutions and say we need to build more of our own institutions. And yet, we have to be honest, it does have often this impact of sending people, down pathways that do not lead to elite status. I mentioned the old WASP establishment. Protestantism in America was always very socioeconomically, ethnically, and racially stratified in the past. And depending on, is your station in life changed, you might have changed denominations. And so the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians were kind of at the top, and then so on down. So there's an old quip, you can hear it in various forms, that the average American starts off as the son of a Baptist farmer. He becomes a Methodist when he gets his first white-collar job. He becomes a Presbyterian when he gets his first promotion. And he becomes an Episcopalian when he joins the C-suite, right? And so as you moved towards elite status, you became absorbed into these mainline elite denominations like Presbyterianism and Episcopalianism. Well, with the sort of collapse of both the Protestant establishment and mainline Protestant denominations, that essentially robbed, and a sort of the secularization of these formerly Christian institutions like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, that essentially robbed Protestants of any sort of institutional home base for their elites. So now there is this sort of same escalator, but what does the escalator lead from? Well, in J.D. Vance's case, it leads from Pentecostalism up to Catholicism. When you get to the top, you're either secular or you become kind of Roman Catholic. It becomes the thing to do. And it's amazing how many of the people you think of as these, nationally prominent Catholic figures are in fact converts to Catholicism, like J.D. Vance, like Ross Douthat, for example, Arthur Brooks, former president of AEI, people like that. There's a lot of them out there. And so I think these things are kind of well known, although they aren't always talked about in terms of elites. So I think rather than a lot of analysis of why is it, what are all the factors that are causing us to underperform, I think the real question we need to answer is there anything we can do about it, right? Is it possible to create an evangelical elite? Is it possible for there to be an evangelical elite? And if it is possible, how might we go about being created? And so when I look at the question of can an evangelical elite actually be created, I look at it, and if you just look at the landscape of evangelicalism, you have to be very skeptical of that, to be honest, because the cultural conditions of evangelicalism are very unfavorable for the emergence of elites for all those factors that I just mentioned. However, I think by definition, an elite is numerically small. So you don't need to transform the whole culture of evangelicalism. You only need to create a space within it within which elites can develop and emerge. And there's this whole question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Do you create sort of institutions and things to try to create elites, or do you first see elites emerge and then they create institutions? I think it's sort of a feedback thing. And so I think that there are things we need to look at, I think both on the institutional side, what evangelicalism could do institutionally, and that could be institutionally as churches, or it could be as other kind of institutions. And then it's like, what can individuals do? So I want to share a couple ideas for that. And to me, I think the first core thing that needs to be done institutionally is that we need to have essentially an expanded theology or a reformed theology of vocation for evangelicalism. And evangelicalism, under the influence of dispensationalism, has long prioritized evangelism over the creation mandate. And then there's sort of evangelical thinking to the extent that a secular vocation has any value at all. It's strictly for the purpose of making money to fund evangelism and other missions work. And in fact, I literally just heard a sermon last Sunday that essentially said basically just that. And there's a famous quip attributed to D.L. Moody, and it's presented in various forms, and maybe I'll get it a little bit wrong, but it's like, anything we do in this world other than saving souls is like polishing the brass on a sinking ship. And that's really, I think, the mindset of a lot of things. And I think the result of that, weirdly, is, Protestantism, one of the things that it was created, and one of the things it did when it was created was reject this idea of Catholic religious vocations, where the priests and the monks were like in superior occupations in the world, and everybody else was sort of, didn't really matter. But, we had this priesthood of all believers, for example, but now we've essentially recreated that inside of evangelicalism, where the people who are doing stuff that matters are the missionaries, or they're the church planters, or the pastors, or the evangelists. It's the people who are out saving souls, and everybody else is sort of just shoveling coal for that effort. The sociologist Andrew Lynn did his dissertation on the evangelical faith and work movement. He studied under James Davison Hunter at the University of Virginia. And this is a movement that was sort of emerged to try to reclaim a more robust theology of vocation for evangelicals. He turned his dissertation into a book. It's called Saving the Protestant Ethic. It is an academic book, but it's very readable, and I thought extremely good and informative. I tried to get him on the podcast, but unfortunately was not successful. But he said, faith and work practitioners themselves, quote, see their religious tradition as completely devoid of any theological frameworks that confer value on secular work, unquote. Now, faith and work leaders have worked hard to try to correct this. but they've only partially been successful. So they assign value to secular work, but they have a sort of a limited vision of what it can be. So if you read faith and work materials, you'll hear things like stressing that conducting business ethically, doing high quality work, sharing the gospel with others in the marketplace, practicing, love your neighbor type relationships with colleagues, taking a redemptive approach to, business or entrepreneurship. Where you can read someone saying a lot of things like this? There's a book, it's called Life in the Negative World by Renn. And there's a whole section where I talk like this in the book. So I'm certainly not someone to say I'm immune from this or to poo-poo these ideas. In fact, they're all great things. We absolutely need to be doing that. But all of these things are completely disconnected from what it means to be an elite in society and what elites actually do in their core day-to-day work. And one of the things that really struck me, I was thinking about this, what is the only work that we see Adam doing in the Garden of Eden prior to the fall? Naming the animals. Naming the animals. This is what I call a structuring and ordering activity. So God undertook his initial structuring and ordering of the universe. He created the day and the night, the light and the dark, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the land, the sea, the air, the plants, the animals, right? The fish, the birds. He created this initial order, and yet he didn't complete it. He left it for man, made in his own image, to take up that creative structuring and ordering work. And this structuring and ordering activity is not just something that is for this age, but is actually also for the age to come. Revelation 5:10 says that we will be ruling over the earth. And in 1 Corinthians 6:3, Paul says, do you not know that you will judge angels? And the thing that really gets me, because, as an evangelical, I always think, if we were assigned the job of naming the animals, what would we do? What would we do? Well, I'll tell you what I would probably do, and my guess is most of you would do something very much like this. Well, it's a big job. I better fast and pray over that and ask what it is God wants me to call all these animals, right? That's what we would do. It's interesting, in the Bible, it's exactly the opposite. Adam doesn't ask God what to call the animals. God brings the animals to Adam and says, Adam, what would you like to call these animals? It's an almost inversion, I think, of how we would normally think about it. And part of this, I think, is this sort of drama of father and son. Adam is called a son of God in the Bible. So God has created his son, Adam, and he wants to see what his boy is going to do. He doesn't just want a robot who will carry out instructions and like that. He wants the son to grow into, to be like the father. And of course, we are children of God as well, if you read First Ephesians. So if you really believe, like I am, a son of God, I'm adopted to the royal house of heaven, then maybe we should be acting like it. I don't know, in some way. That's just kind of how I look at it. Again, I say I'm not a pastor or a theologian, and so maybe I'll get into a debate with Andrew in the speaker event. But I think it's a very, very different conception of work than we tend to think of, or that is typically taught in the evangelical faith and work initiative. And this sort of confident structuring and ordering of society is what people in top positions do. Charles Colomb wrote in Palladium magazine something that really, I think, was a great summation. He said, quote, a true elite creates and recreates its institutions rather than merely staffing them. And that's something that, like the old WASP were able to do. They could create and recreate institutions. Too often today, even our actual elites are just staffing the institutions. We're not creating NATO, we're just staffing NATO. We're just staffing these things that were created a long time ago. And evangelical theology does not encourage people to do this kind of thing, nor does it even really give permission for you to want to do that, or even give you permission to want to be in a position to do it. Now, there is one exception to this, And that is the dominionist theology associated with new apostolic reformations and other such movements. You'll hear them talk about the so-called Seven Mountains Mandate, encouraging Christians to take over religion, the family, education, government, media, the arts, and business. Interestingly, this tends to be, my observation, is a middle-class Pentecostal phenomenon associated with populist leaders who sometimes call themselves apostles. And occasionally these people will get into some sort of position that seems elite on the surface, although I think they're often much less influential than you might think. I would put Trump faith advisor Paula White in this category. She's a prosperity preacher. She doesn't call herself an apostle, but various other people call her an apostle. I wouldn't say she's probably particularly influential in the world in the grand scheme of things. But I think when you look at things like this, you look at the Paula Whites and the people who are in that world, what it does is it does not serve as a theology of vocation, right? It's not a plausible theology of vocation for would-be elites. I think it only discredits the idea in mainstream evangelicalism of, we should try to be elites. People say, well, look at these guys. We don't want to do that. Now, in mainstream evangelicalism, the most cited work is Tim Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, Connecting Your Work to God's Work. And this book is a very significant advance in vocational theology beyond the sort of thing that I laid out as sort of the baseline faith and work movement. So he does, for example, talk about naming the animals, and he does talk about structuring and ordering activity. He writes, for example, quote, "Work not only cares for creation, but also directs and structures it," unquotes. And, quote, "That is the pattern for all work. It is creative and assertive. It is rearranging the raw material of God's creation," unquote. However, these little snippets are basically just that. They're a very tiny portion of the book. Most of it is the same stuff that I listed before. And I think it's also very interesting that he doesn't give a single clear example anywhere in the book of someone who is in an obvious elite position engaged in a structuring and ordering activity. And in fact, I went through and wrote down every illustration that he used. There were 28 illustrations in the book. None of them involve a positive portrayal of someone engaged in elite activity in which they use the central power of their role to direct, shape, reorder, or restructure some element of society. But we do have examples of elites behaving badly, and we also have multiple examples of people taking a step back from high-powered positions in favor of, looking for more fulfilling work or more ethical work. It is, I think, very much in the vein of sort of saying the pursuit of elite is kind of bad, implicitly bad. It's certainly not validated. And so I think while Every Good Endeavor was an important step forward, its approach, we need to build on it and we need to extend it even further. Evangelicalism needs a theology of vocation and of the exercise of power that validates and valorizes people doing things like restructuring trade or immigration policy to reduce income inequality, inventing new mobility technology like electric or autonomous vehicles, becoming president of a top university and transforming it to restore trust in the institution, acquiring control over a major culture-shaping media property or foundation, curing cancer, or of course, becoming a Supreme Court justice. And I think these sorts of things are not what we talk about when we talk about vocation in the world. This is a key need institutionally and that the church needs to take on. The second thing we need to do institutionally, and I'm not sure that it's a particular institution, but it's sort of systemic to evangelicalism, is to establish a patronage ecosystem. It is very difficult to reach the senior levels of society without patronage. This goes beyond just hiring people to include things like mentorship, introductions, recommendations, public and private championing, admission to exclusive groups or institutions, and financial sponsorship. Evangelicalism lacks a theory and ecosystem of patronage at the elite levels. Evangelicals overwhelmingly fund and support people who focus on explicitly Christian ministry. Yeah, when I was interviewing someone who kind of worked in the evangelical world about this, he said, it's really easy, or he didn't say it that way, it's like there are very established pathways to raise money if you want to be a missionary, a church planter, or a campus pastor, right? But if you want to do something outside of that world, if you want to do anything in the secular domains of society, there's nothing. There's basically zero ecosystem there. I also think, if I were going to do a PhD, I've got a few little topics I would be interested in doing, but one of them is studying the social structures of evangelicalism, because it seems to me that evangelicalism, being very populist in orientation, is also structured around sort of charismatic leaders and their kind of very loyal followers. And so you can kind of think about Trump and his supporters, right? And that kind of a relationship there, where essentially the patronage flow is kind of upwards in loyalty, but kind of downwards, you're a little bit of a lackey. And, I think evangelical leaders, people, can be very hesitant to provide patronage to people who are outside of their mafia or outside of their tribe. It seems like they're more likely to view those people as a potential threat or rival than someone they would like to support. And so I think the net result is that the evangelicals who do manage to find patronage often find it from non-evangelicals. And so I'll give one example of this, and that's a guy by the name of Brad Littlejohn. Now, I picked Brad Littlejohn for a very simple reason. He is what my friend likes to call 200% respectable. It's not like, well, Aaron, I can understand why nobody wants to support you because you say all these controversial things. He doesn't say or do controversial things by and large. He's a millennial ethicist and political theorist. He's got a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. He went to Washington and wanted to build a career there. And where did his jobs come from? Well, they came from an Orthodox Jew who was Yoram Hazony at the Edmund Burke Foundation. It came from a very serious traditionalist Catholic, Ryan Anderson, at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And then his current job came from a secular Jew, Orrin Cass, at American Compass. And he founded a think tank, a small think tank called the Davenant Institute, which was dedicated to trying to revive the study of the Reformers. And I think it's interesting, he ran that for a decade and was really never really able to raise any material amount of money for it, even though it was doing kind of interesting and cool stuff. And you would have said the people associated with it would have been the highest potential, high-profile, rising Reformed thinkers in the evangelical world. And I just think the reality is there's no evangelical patronage or intellectual ecosystem, right? Leaders, funders, institutions in, say, Washington, D.C., in the way that there are these Catholic ones. And in fact, the fact is evangelicals more often find help from friendly Catholics than they find from their own people. And I think that is a big factor in why so many people end up converting to Catholicism. It's like, wow, they treat me so much better than my own people treat me. They give me these opportunities. Now, in his final white paper, The Decline and Renewal of the American Church, Tim Keller also called for the creation of a patronage ecosystem as part of what he called his Christian Mind Project. So he suggested the creation of a think tank, endowed chairs at top universities, grants to young Christian scholars, and what he called a Christian Federalist Society. I think all these types of initiatives are particularly useful, but I think the most important thing is we need to have a new attitude. Evangelicals have to be willing to support competent and high potential people of good character outside of their own internal factions or tribes who are engaged in or pursuing elite activities in the world. And there's something just not happening there. So I'll give a Keller example. He wrote this paper, The Decline and Renewal of the American Church, which I just referenced. And one of the things that he said in there was that what we need is somebody to create a Protestant social teaching to sort of compete with Catholic social teaching. You know, the Catholic social teaching has become this big hot thing, and so many people are attracted to it. It seems like, oh, wow, that's great. We need a Protestant social teaching. Well, as it happened, the Davenant Institute had a volume edited by Brad Littlejohn called Protestant Social Teaching. And in fact, Tim Keller knew about it, and after he died, one of his seminary students in New York wrote an article talking about his experience with that and mentioned that in one of their seminary classes at RTS New York, Keller held up the volume and actually praised it as having a lot of great things. And yet, to the best of my knowledge, he never publicly even acknowledged the existence of that book. So he's calling for a Protestant social teaching. He knows and likes a book called The Protestant Social Teaching, but he's not out there repping the book called Protestant Social Teaching. And I bought a copy of it. I actually haven't read it, but I wanted to see who endorsed this book. And I flip over the book and look at the backside. You know who endorsed it? Ryan Anderson, the Catholic thinker, has got an endorsement on there. And I'm like, I'm sure that Keller had reasons why he didn't want to do that. I'm not saying this is nefarious. What I'm saying is, this is why we lose, right? We will never get anywhere as long as stuff like that is happening, and that is the norm, not the exception, to how the evangelical world works. In the absence of a proper patronage system that provides personal, institutional, and financial support, it is highly unlikely many evangelicals will ever reach senior levels of society outside of politics and business. And those who do, I think there's a high percentage chance they're going to convert to Catholicism along the way. And again, this one did not get included in the actual piece that's going to go in first things. I had to take a little bit of space out because, you always got to shrink it a little bit. I think one idea that I have, a simple way to start creating this, is massive amounts of evangelical donor money flows into all these Washington conservative institutions. These donors should have expectations around hiring of evangelicals all the way up the organizational chart as a condition of providing all of this money that they're giving to these institutions. It ought to come with frankly, some strings attached, implicitly at least. But again, while I think these items like an updated theology of vocation and a patronage ecosystem, they're very important, I don't think they themselves are going to be able to conjure this sort of thing out of out of the ether, if you will. I think the truth is the kind of necessary element that it will take for there to be an evangelical elite is for sort of lay people, probably pretty young, who start rethinking their life's ambitions and their life's directions, pushing towards attending these things, attempting to reach these positions. And then as more and more of them actually do, obviously you create models, and the more models you have, the more people want to do it, and then the institutions will emerge, et cetera. I don't think we're going to create all these institutions and all of a sudden, they're just going to pop this elite. I'm not saying we shouldn't create those, but I think ultimately it is going to take individuals who decide this is what I'm going to do. And so I think Protestant laymen, sort of evangelical laymen, who wish to succeed in reaching elite status and helping to regenerate an actual class of Protestant leaders in America today, have to reorient themselves individually in a number of ways. So what do we need to do as individuals rather than institutions? And I think the first one is obviously you have to have an ambition towards high-level accomplishment and achieving the senior positions from which you can undertake genuine structuring and ordering activity. A young person at a very early age has to conceive of the ambition, I want to be on the Supreme Court. I want to be in one of these places. And of course, what do you have to do? You then have to achieve commensurate competence and credentialing, consistent with that. You have to understand and navigate pathways of influence and power. So that's like kind of the basics. Of course, obviously, that's just how do you make it in the world. But I think there are other things as well. And first, I think one thing is they need, people who are like this need to be willing to publicly center their Protestant identity in the way that Catholics do. And again, think about someone like Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. Her Catholic identity is very central to her public persona of who she is. And, or you can think about Notre Dame political scientist Patrick Deneen, who's also like I'm the Catholic thinker. Maybe I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I think that's something that very rarely happens today in a lot of ways. Protestant elites tend not to talk about, believe it or not, tend not to talk about their religion all that much. The second thing I think they need to do is to be open to collaborating with each other on what I call a shared broad theological traditionalism, which would mean like agreement on the essentials of the faith, like the Nicene Creed, the centrality of the gospel, such as salvation by faith alone, the moral law, say the Ten Commandments. But I think, we're talking about here lay people working in secular domains, not in churches or ecclesial structures. So I think you can't get too bound up about various denominational particularities around things like baptism, or even like things that are big sources of debates in the church, like women's ordination or young earth creationism. I mean, if you're trying to work in a secular thing with someone and they also have to believe in some particular things like that, again, you're never going to get anywhere. It's kind of a recipe for, shrinking your coalition. Again, we're not talking about church here. We're talking about secular activities. The third thing I think we need to do is to lean into this Protestant fragmentation and stratification I talked about earlier. Protestantism is very fragmented, and that actually works in our favor, because what that means is you don't have to worry about convincing this mass of evangelicals to go along with what you're doing or even liking what you're doing all that much. You can say that's great to be them, but we'll be there. And I think the reality is a lot of evangelical movements are particularly ill-suited to the pursuit of elite positions and that kind of leadership. And in fact, I think they might even be hostile to it. They wouldn't like it. They might attack you for it. So I think about, fundamentalists, dispensationalists, Anabaptists, people like that. And so I think if we lean into fragmentation, that allows space, that allows a space to emerge within evangelical world that's more sympathetic to elite development without being burdened of like, I got to make all these other people like me kind of thing. Now, I think here's the key. Here's where this gets difficult. At the same time, it's important not to counter-signal those people or to kind of overly define yourself in opposition to some other kind of evangelical group. I mean, if you look at these Catholic elites, for example, the liberals and conservatives are going at each other, but it's elites going at elites. It's not, you don't hear elite Catholics mocking, peasant Catholic practices in Latin America and all kinds of weird things. Like there's a bunch of very low status, lower and middle class Catholicism. They don't spend a lot of time worrying about what those people are doing. They're just like, it's not a central concern of theirs. And I think we have to be able to do that ourselves. We have to be able to detach from some of the attributes of mainstream evangelicalism, which inhibit high-level accomplishment and activity, but without remaining captive to them in a negative sense. And of course, the best example of this is the so-called ex-evangelical phenomenon. I'm leaving the evangelical church, but I'm still obsessed with it. I'm writing books critiquing it, all of that things. And I was raised in an Assemblies of God church. I was raised Pentecostal, and you know what? I think Pentecostals are doing great work. There's a lot of great things that Pentecostals are doing. The megachurch pastors and the Great Commission people, they're doing great stuff. Like, I think we can celebrate what they're doing and say that's great, but what I've been called to is something else. You might think about the old Episcopalians. They just weren't that worried about what the Baptists were doing. They were doing their thing and let other people do theirs. I think that's part of it. We need to do our thing and let other people do their thing and not think, wow, I have to somehow convince all these people to like me, or I gotta somehow really make it clear that I'm not like those people over there. I think the fourth thing, so what did I talk about? I talked about, centering Protestant identity, collaboration in lay matters on broad theological traditionalism, leaning into fragmentation, and the fourth thing is becoming more culturally confident, cultural confidence. I think Andrew maybe kind of draw on some of what Andrew said. Maybe I think about it slightly differently, but similar to that is you got to be comfortable participating in these elite institutions and spaces, while at the same time having a degree of critical detachment from them. You got to believe that Protestant Christianity has something better to offer, right? Have something better to offer the world, right? The way that the Catholics think, they're very comfortable, right, being in these elite milieus, but they're also very comfortable saying something like, hey, Catholic social teaching is a better way to inform public policy. So finding a way to be comfortable there and that. And so there's this isn't in the article, but there's a term that was coined to describe the culture of Australia called cultural cringe. You can look it up. And cultural cringe theory says that people in the colonies have a sense of inferiority about their own culture relative to the capital, relative to the metropole. So people in Australia think of their culture as inferior to English culture in London and things of that nature. And by the way, we even have some of that. Whenever we hear somebody with an English accent, we just think they're a little more posh. We think they're a little more smarter. We think they're more, whatever. Just even if it's a low status English accent that we don't recognize, it just seems great. And so I think a lot that has really, really been something that has bedeviled what I call cultural engagement Christianity. These are the heavily urbanized, highly educated, upper middle class professionals in places like big cities and college towns. This is the place you would expect elites to emerge from, but they seem very, very, very kind of ashamed of evangelicalism and its culture, and they sort of think that the secular culture is superior, in so many ways, and so they sort of failed the cultural confidence test, in my opinion. And I think they also failed the previous point because they have really defined themselves in opposition to culture war Christianity. I mean, how many times you can open up the internet every single day, flip up your computer, your phone, and there's somebody complaining about Trump voting evangelicals. Or they're in the New York Times bashing other evangelicals, right? So it's like, we're not like those people. We're not those people. We're not those people. It's always about we're not like them, and wow, we feel kind of cringy and sort of inferior. So we really want to make sure that we fit in, and they're gonna let us sit at their table. And I think these are two of the factors of why this sort of cultural engagement Christianity didn't really produce a lot of influence in the culture or elites, because the sort of pursuit of respectability and conformity isn't compelling to other people, and it doesn't structure or order anything. And I think a lot of it was really predicated on a naive version of sociologist James Davison Hunter's teachings on cultural change. If you've ever read his book, To Change the World, he goes through this. Hunter teaches, and by the way, he's completely correct on this, that culture changes via networks of elites in institutions that are at the cultural center. And typically not the very center of the center, but just outside of the center But literally just being present in these institutions, in these spaces, does not make you a change agent. And I think that cultural engagement evangelism focused on gaining access to the spaces like the Ivy League, but without a vision for what to do with it once you're in there. It's sort of like I think it's the South Park underpants gnome meme. You ever seen that one? They have this business plan. Step 1, collect underpants. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, profit, right? And I think it's like that, except it's step 1, create a network of elites, gain access to elite spaces. Point 2, question mark. Point 3, change the world. There's sort of a connection in there. There's a missing point 2 somewhere in the middle. Just showing up there, oh, now I'm going to be faithfully present while I'm here. That doesn't actually do anything. And I think that is why the existing evangelical presence in places like the Ivy League makes so little impact in the world. It certainly didn't make any impression on J.D. Vance at Yale Law School. If you read his conversion narratives, I've got a couple different ones where he's written about his conversion to Catholicism. He talks about how he grew up in kind of low church Pentecostalism. Now he's like, I'm at Yale Law, I'm an elite. This other stuff down here doesn't seem very plausible. But hey, I met these Catholics and Mormons, and wow, they seem like they're pretty, fit in with this elite world. They're very religious. They're very impressive. He also talks about Peter Thiel, who is Protestant but not an evangelical, and he doesn't even mention evangelicals at all. And I know there's got to be some evangelicals at Yale Law School. Maybe we should get Nate Fischer to talk about evangelicals at Harvard Law School, and I'm sure he's got some great stories for you. But it's like we want to get into these spaces, but they leave zero impression once they get there. And again, I contrast this approach with, again, the Catholic one. I think about Patrick Deneen, who, what did he do? He didn't defend 1980s Reaganism all day, every day. He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed. A forthright statement of here are some things fundamentally wrong with our system. And by the way, that made him a topic of like real conversation in the elite domains of society. And you know who basically touted his book? Barack Obama. It's like, you got to read this book. Something to think about. And then my last, so I think this idea of cultural confidence that's not defined in opposition to other people is really important. And then the last thing I'll talk about, which maybe many people won't like here, but I think we need to adopt a mindset of being a minority within a pluralistic elite. So Protestantism needs to develop a new posture towards the culture than it had historically, because things like the WASP leadership that I mentioned yesterday, this was created in essentially a nation that was hegemonically Protestant. I mean, people don't realize how Protestant America was. We were 98% Protestant at the founding. We're actually still plurality Protestant. I think we're still about 40% of people will identify as Protestant, but the ones who go to church maybe down like 25%. We're getting a lot lower there, but we're no longer a majority. It's no longer a Protestant hegemonic society, and it's certainly any would-be Protestant evangelical elites will be a minority within the elite, to say the least. And so I think, we need to find a way to operate in there, create group consciousness, not be resigning yourself to be a second-class citizen, and yet be comfortable working with a lot of people. Again, forget about like partnering, denominationally within sort of Protestant with initiatives on this broad theological traditionalism, but also being able to work with people who have very, very different values, because that's the reality of what you'll be dealing with. And I think as part of that, like one thing I'd say is, we need to have a lot thicker skin and just not let the insults and the negative things just, get under our skin. I really got to do that. And I think the guy here who I think is a great example of what I'm talking about is actually Mitt Romney. Romney is a lifelong member of the LDS Mormon Church, which, from the standpoint of, call it Nicene Orthodox Christianity, I think could fairly be classified as a heretical sect. And certainly very low status in America for a very long time. But what did he do? He has a track record of accomplishment in the highest level in multiple domains. He co-founded Bain Capital. He was elected governor of Massachusetts, senator from Utah. He turned around the failing and corrupt Salt Lake City Olympics. And, in his campaigns and in his things, and especially in 2012, he was subjected to a lot of taunts and insults. So like the left called him Hitler, and the right, and including a lot of evangelicals said, he's in a cult. You can't vote for this guy because he's in a cult. But if you looked at him, he sort of took the high road. He didn't just, respond to most of the attacks. He's like, I got to focus on my mission and taking care of what I want to take on. He didn't get elected president, but like everything else he tried, he was extraordinarily successful at. So I think, there's a lot we could learn from Romney, not theologically, but just in how he conducted himself in a sort of pluralistic world where many people didn't share his religious convictions. And so again, whether this sort of Protestant elite or evangelical elite could ever emerge again in America, again, as sort of a speculative project, but I do think some of these things around theology of vocation, patronage ecosystem, some of the individual things will make it much more likely. And what I would say is, the truth is, we need evangelical elites in society because, number one, America may no longer be majority Protestant, but it is culturally and institutionally Protestant. And I think that, therefore, we actually have unique ability to lead in ways that are very resonant, authentically resonant with America. Whereas someone like Patrick Deneen, frankly, Patrick Deneen doesn't like the American founding very much, doesn't like Protestantism very much. Nobody's ever going to go for Patrick Deneen approaches, right? They're not going to go for Curtis Yarvin approaches. They're not going to go for all this outre stuff. But I think we can do things that are well within the American cultural and political tradition that I think would be much more resonant with the culture. And again, just think, when you have a quarter of the population, let's say we're a quarter of the population of the country is evangelical, you can debate the exact, but it's a lot. If a quarter of the people aren't supplying their fair share of the leadership in our country, no wonder, right, we're not doing too well. So I think, maybe one of the things that would actually fix our leadership problem if a lot more evangelicals and Protestants manage to, take their places, in the actual halls of power and in these institutions. And I hope we're able to figure it out. Thank you.